We found it tucked away in a dusty old box, a forgotten relic from a time when life moved slower and images were rare treasures. It was a photograph, sepia-toned, its edges softened by a century of neglect. The paper itself felt thin and fragile, threatening to crumble if handled too roughly. Holding it up, the light caught the faint creases and small tears that marked its journey through time. This wasn't just any old picture. It was a window, slightly fogged, into the late 1800s, a period of stiff collars, elaborate dresses, and a certain quiet formality that feels alien to us now. The image had that unmistakable look of an antique, a true piece of history. The scene it captured was a classic 1890s photography studio. You could almost smell the chemicals and the faint scent of velvet. The background was a painted canvas, probably depicting a hazy, romantic landscape, a common trick to add a touch of grandeur to otherwise simple portraits. There was a small ornate table, perhaps holding a book or a decorative vase, and a heavy, carved wooden chair where the subject would have been asked to sit. The lighting, though frozen in time, suggested the soft, diffused glow of a large window or an early artificial light source, carefully positioned to flatter the sitter. Everything about the studio, from the props to the posture of the subject, spoke of a deliberate attempt to create a dignified, lasting impression. It was a snapshot of a moment meticulously staged for prosperity, and there she was, the central figure in this preserved fragment of the past. A woman dressed in the fashion of the era, her dark dress featuring a high collar and puffed sleeves, common for the time. Her hair was neatly styled, probably pinned up in an intricate bun, though the details were a little soft with age. She sat with an air of quiet composure, her hands clasped delicately in her lap. Her gaze, directed slightly off camera, held a certain intensity, a seriousness that many people adopted when having their photograph taken, perhaps due to the long exposure times, or simply the gravity of the occasion. She was elegant, poised, a typical subject for a portrait of her time. But then your eyes drifted, not to her face or her hands, but to something else in the frame. To her left, standing tall and prominent against the painted backdrop, was a large oval-shaped mirror. It was framed in dark, heavy wood, possibly mahogany, and its surface gleamed faintly, catching some of the studio light. It was clearly an intentional part of the studio setup, a prop meant to add depth or a touch of domestic elegance to the composition. It was impossible to ignore, drawing the eye with its reflective surface. At first, it just seemed like another detail, another piece of the 1890s puzzle. But then, a flicker of something unsettled you. You looked back at the woman, then at the mirror, and then back at the woman again. There was something off, a tiny whisper of wrongness that you couldn't quite place. It was like a word on the tip of your tongue, a melody you almost recognized but couldn't quite hum. The feeling was subtle, a mere ripple in the calm surface of your observation. Then it hit you, a cold jolt that went straight through you. The woman was clearly positioned in front of the mirror. Her body was angled towards it, a shoulder almost touching its frame. Yet in the mirror's reflective surface there was nothing. No trace of her elegant dress, no hint of her carefully styled hair, no outline of her composed figure. The mirror showed only the painted backdrop behind her, an empty expanse of hazy landscape. Her reflection, despite her undeniable presence, was entirely absent. It was as if she simply didn't exist to the glass. An immediate sense of unease settled in. Your heart gave a little skip. It was impossible, wasn't it? A photographic error, a trick of the light. But the angle seemed clear. The woman, undeniably in front of the mirror. How could a reflection simply vanish? The questions piled up, each one more chilling than the last. Was this some kind of early photographic manipulation, or was something far stranger at play? The image, once just an old photo, now felt like a riddle, a silent scream from the past. The photograph had been found among a box of old family heirlooms, passed down through generations. No one in the family remembered who the woman was or where the picture came from exactly. It was simply that old photo, one of many historical curiosities that had survived the decades. Its origin seemed utterly ordinary, a common studio portrait from a bygone era, until you looked closely enough to see the impossible. It had no special story attached to it, no whispered legends. It was just there, waiting to be noticed. The lasting impression it left was profound. Once you saw the missing reflection, you couldn't unsee it. Every time you looked at the photograph, your eyes went straight to that empty mirror, a silent void where a human image should have been. It hung in the air, a constant, unsettling presence, a visual paradox that defied logic. It was a quiet horror, a mystery etched onto a piece of faded paper. And so, the photograph presented itself as an unspoken challenge. It demanded attention, begged for an explanation. It wasn't just an old picture anymore. It was a doorway to a forgotten story, a silent invitation to delve deeper into its impossible secret. The unsettling anomaly was too glaring to ignore, pulling you into its strange, timeless web. The unsettling anomaly of the missing reflection spurred an immediate need for answers. The first step was to try and identify the photography studio itself. This wasn't an easy task, given the age of the photograph and the lack of identifying marks on the picture's front or back. It was a painstaking process, starting with a close examination of the backdrop and the few visible props, hoping for a unique detail that might point to a specific photographer or studio. Online archives of 19th century commercial photography, local historical society records, and old city directories became the primary hunting grounds. It meant sifting through countless entries, cross-referencing names, and comparing known studio styles from the era. Many hours were spent poring over digitized newspapers, looking for advertisements for photography businesses that matched the period and aesthetic. Eventually, after weeks of tedious research, a breakthrough came. A small, almost illegible watermark on the lower right corner of the original photograph, invisible to the naked eye, but enhanced through digital magnification, revealed a faint initial and a partial street name. Further digging through old city maps and business registries from the 1880s and 1890s led to a possible match. A. Blackwood and Son Photographic Studio, located on what was then Elm Street. The specific address was long gone. The original building likely demolished decades ago, but the approximate location, a now bustling commercial district, was pinpointed. It felt like a small victory, a tangible link to the past. With the studio identified, the search expanded to local historical societies and newspaper archives. The hope was to find more information about A. Blackwood and his son, their business, and perhaps even some context for the unusual photograph. What emerged was a fragmented picture, pieces of local gossip and half-forgotten tales that painted a slightly unsettling portrait. The Blackwood studio had been moderately successful for a time, known for its elegant portraits and innovative techniques. However, there were whispers, vague mentions in old town records and local history books about the studio's later years. Nothing concrete, just hints of eccentricity. One recurring anecdote, often dismissed as old wives' tales, spoke of strange smells emanating from the studio at odd hours, and a general air of unease that settled over the place. Some said Mr. Blackwood, the elder, became obsessed with capturing more than just an image. He wanted to capture the essence of his subjects. This was, of course, just folklore, the kind of exaggerated stories that grow around any slightly unusual local figure. Yet reading them now, with the impossible photograph in hand, they took on a new, more sinister meaning. The studio owner, A. Blackwood, was described in one archived newspaper clipping as a man of intense focus, perhaps to a fault. His son, less so, fading from the records after a few years. It seemed the elder Blackwood ran the studio mostly on his own later on. There were no grand scandals or criminal records, but a persistent undercurrent of oddness. People stopped going to him as much towards the end, choosing other, more conventional photographers. The studio's demise was not a sudden dramatic event, but a slow, quiet fading. It simply closed down sometime in the early 1900s. The building eventually sold and repurposed. No grand announcement, no farewell. It just ceased to be. Local legends connected to the property, even after the studio was long gone, spoke of a cold spot where the building once stood, or the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Children were warned not to play near the vacant lot for too long. These were the kinds of stories that small towns tell themselves, often baseless, born from boredom or a need for local color. But now they felt like breadcrumbs leading down a dark path. These early findings, though circumstantial, began to form a tentative connection. The unusual nature of the photographer, the strange local folklore, the quiet closure of the studio, it all started to coalesce around the central mystery of the photograph. It was a far cry from definitive proof, but the accumulating evidence began to paint a picture of something more sinister than a mere photographic error. The missing reflection wasn't just a quirk, it was becoming a deliberate, unsettling detail in a much larger, darker narrative. The initial unease deepened into a growing suspicion that the photograph was not just old, but historically significant in a way no one could have imagined. The more layers uncovered, the less accidental the anomaly seemed, and the more deliberate the absence of the reflection felt. The next step was to focus on the woman in the photograph. Who was she? Her elegant pose and fine dress suggested a certain social standing, but without a name, she was just a beautiful face frozen in time. The search became an attempt to give her an identity, to pull her out of the anonymous past and connect her to the strange history of the Blackwood studio. This meant diving into genealogical records, census data, and old city directories, looking for women who fit the general profile and timeline. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but one with a very specific, unsettling shadow cast over it. Online databases were a starting point, sifting through thousands of names, birth dates, and family connections. The late 1800s were a period where record-keeping was improving, but still far from perfect. Many records were handwritten, sometimes faded, and often incomplete. It required patience and a methodical approach, cross-referencing every potential lead. I looked for women whose families might have lived in the area of the Blackwood studio, focusing on those who would have been of an age to sit for such a portrait around the time the studio was active. It was slow, tedious work, often yielding nothing but dead ends and names that didn't quite fit. Then came the deeper dive into local historical societies and newspaper archives. These were often treasure troves of personal histories, obituaries, and social notices. I spent hours poring over microfiche and scanned documents, looking for any mention of a woman fitting the photograph's description. The hope was to find a name, a family, a story that could anchor the image to reality. It was in one of these dusty archives, tucked away in an old society column describing local events, that a name finally surfaced: Ilara Vance. The article was a brief mention of a local social gathering, listing attendees. Ilara Vance was noted for her striking beauty and quiet demeanor. The date of the article placed her squarely within the Blackwood studio's active period. This was a fragile lead, but it was a lead nonetheless. From there, the search branched out, specifically targeting Ilara Vance. Genealogical records confirmed her existence, her birth year, and her family's presence in the area. She came from a respectable, though not exceptionally wealthy family. Her father was a moderately successful merchant, her mother a homemaker. Further digging revealed more about Ilara's background. She was known to be artistic, with a fondness for poetry and sketching. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent and somewhat reserved, often preferring her own company to large social events. She had aspirations, according to a distant cousin's archived letter, of perhaps becoming a teacher or even a writer, though such ambitions were often difficult for women of her era to achieve. She was also known to be quite particular about her appearance, which made the idea of her sitting for a portrait entirely plausible. She was, in many ways, an ordinary young woman of her time, with dreams and a place in her community. But then came the unsettling part. The records around Ilara Vance grew sparse after a certain point. Her name appeared in social notices for a few years, then abruptly stopped. There was no marriage record, no obituary, no mention of her moving away. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. I found a brief, almost clinical mention in a local police ledger from a few years after the photograph was likely taken. Missing person report, Ilara Vance, no leads, case closed. It was a cold, stark statement that offered no comfort, no explanation. The circumstances of her disappearance were, in essence, unknown. There were no sensational headlines, no public outcry, just a quiet, unexplained vanishing. Family histories, when I could piece them together from distant relatives' accounts, offered vague explanations. She went away, she sought a new life, she was always a bit flighty. These were clearly attempts to gloss over a painful, unresolved event. The lack of a clear, consistent story surrounding her absence was in itself a red flag. People didn't just disappear without a trace, especially not from respectable families, without some kind of official or unofficial explanation. The family's grief and silence were palpable, even through the decades. The subject of Ilara Vance seemed to become taboo, a wound that never healed. Subsequent generations rarely spoke of her, or if they did, it was with a hushed tone, implying a tragedy best left undisturbed. It became clear that whatever happened to Ilara Vance, it was not something her family wanted to remember or discuss. Their silence was a heavy blanket covering an unresolved pain. The dawning realization was chilling. The photograph might not just be a picture of Ilara Vance, but the last, tangible evidence of her. It was a final glimpse of a life that was abruptly cut short, or perhaps fundamentally altered. The missing reflection wasn't just a photographic anomaly, it was a symbol, a premonition, or even a direct consequence of her fate. The image, once a curiosity, now felt like a silent scream. This personal connection to the mystery deepened the emotional weight of the investigation. It was no longer just about solving an academic puzzle. It was about a young woman whose story had been lost, whose very presence had been erased. The photograph, with its haunting blankness where her reflection should be, became a memorial, a testament to her unknown fate. The enigma had a face, a name, and a tragic, unexplained disappearance. Ilara Vance was no longer just a subject in an old photo. She was a victim, and the photograph was her only witness. This human element transformed the entire quest, making it less an intellectual exercise and more a solemn duty to uncover the truth for a ghost from the past. The mystery had become deeply personal. The focus now shifted to the man behind the lens, the photographer who had captured Ilara Vance's image, or rather the lack of her reflection. His name, I discovered, was Arthur Penhaligon. He wasn't just a regular studio photographer. He had a reputation for being somewhat peculiar, even for his time. While most photographers aimed for straightforward, flattering portraits, Penhaligon was known for his artistic approach, often experimenting with light, shadows, and unusual compositions. He wasn't just taking pictures, he was trying to create something more. His fascination with the ethereal was evident in his surviving works. I managed to track down a few of his other photographs from various archives, and they all shared a common thread. There were portraits where subjects seemed to dissolve into mist, landscapes where trees appeared to weep, and still lifes that hinted at a life beyond the frame. He wasn't interested in simple realism. He sought to capture the unseen, the spiritual, the very essence of things. He often spoke in his rare published interviews about drawing out the spirit of his subjects, a phrase that, in light of Elara's photograph, took on a much darker meaning. He believed photography was more than just mechanics. It was a way to touch the soul. The most disturbing discovery came from a collection of fragmented personal journals, tucked away in an old historical society's forgotten box. They weren't polished writings, but rather raw, intense scribblings. In them, Penhaligon detailed his growing obsession with the veil between worlds. He wrote about wanting to peel back the layers of reality and make the invisible manifest. He believed that reflections were not just optical illusions, but portals, temporary windows into what he called the ethereal plane. He saw the camera as a tool, not just for recording, but for manipulating these unseen forces. He wrote about a special project, a lifelong endeavor to capture pure essence. The entries became increasingly manic, filled with esoteric symbols and complex, almost ritualistic diagrams that seemed to blend photographic processes with ancient mysticism. He was convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a way to permanently fix the spirit, to hold it outside its physical form. There were also hushed rumors, passed down through generations in the local community, about a secret room in Penhaligon's studio. It wasn't advertised, rarely used, and supposedly kept locked at all times. Some whispered it was where he conducted his more unconventional experiments, away from prying eyes. One old newspaper clipping, a small social notice, mentioned Penhaligon had become increasingly reclusive in his later years, shunning society and dedicating himself entirely to his work. He was described as a man consumed by his art, but the tone hinted at something more unsettling than mere artistic dedication. Neighbors spoke of strange lights emanating from his studio late at night and peculiar smells, dismissed at the time as photographic chemicals. The most chilling revelation, however, came from cross-referencing Penhaligon's client list, which I meticulously reconstructed from ledgers and old appointment books with local disappearance records. Elara Vance was not an isolated case. Over the years, at least 3 other individuals who had sat for portraits with Arthur Penhaligon had also vanished without a trace. Their disappearances, like Elara's, were often attributed to simply moving on or leaving town, but the pattern was undeniable. All were young, relatively unattached, and had no clear reason to suddenly sever all ties. The common thread was Penhaligon's studio, and specifically portraits that were described as unusually striking or hauntingly realistic. The mirror in Elara's photograph, it became clear, was no mere prop. Penhaligon's journals explicitly mentioned the use of reflective surfaces as conduits. He experimented with different types of mirrors, believing some possessed unique properties to draw out what he called the inner self. The mirror was an integral part of his dark craft, a key component in his twisted vision. He wasn't just trying to take a picture of Elara Vance. He was using the mirror, the camera, and his esoteric knowledge to achieve something far more sinister. The seed of intent was now undeniable. The missing reflection was not an accident, a trick of light, or a flaw in the photographic process. It was a deliberate outcome, the horrifying result of Penhaligon's obsession. He hadn't simply failed to capture Elara's reflection. He had actively prevented it from appearing, perhaps even extracted it. The photograph was not just a record of a moment, but a testament to a horrific act, a dark ritual performed under the guise of art. Arthur Penhaligon was not just a photographer. He was something far more sinister, a collector of essences, and Elara Vance, with her missing reflection, was proof of his grim success. The mystery had shifted from a simple anomaly to a deliberate, chilling act of malevolence. The theories about Penhaligon's dark practices began to solidify, moving beyond mere speculation. It wasn't just about his fascination with capturing the intangible. It was about actively manipulating it. His journals hinted at this, but now, with the full picture emerging, it was clear he was engaged in something akin to a cult ritual. The studio itself, when re-examined through this lens, started to reveal hidden meanings. The specific arrangement of certain props, the angles of the mirrors, even the choice of clothing for his subjects, all seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. There were often specific floral arrangements, dried herbs, or small, unusual figurines present in his set designs, items that, when researched, had connections to various folk magic traditions or symbolic representations of spiritual transference. The mirror, in particular, stood out not just as a tool, but as a central element in his dark craft. Historically, mirrors have been seen as more than just reflective surfaces. Across cultures, they are often considered thresholds, gateways, or conduits to other realms. Penhaligon seemed to exploit this ancient belief, viewing the mirror in his studio not as a simple piece of furniture, but as a critical component in his experiments. He wrote extensively about the veil between worlds and how polished glass could thin it. He believed that during the photographic process, especially with the concentrated light and the subject's focused attention, the mirror could be used to separate a part of the person, specifically their reflection, and hold it. His tools were not just cameras and chemicals. There were mentions of specific types of incense, tinctures, and even certain metals he would incorporate into the studio setup. He talked about attuning the space before a session, describing complex preparations that involve precise placements of objects and burning specific aromatic compounds. These weren't standard photographic practices. They were elements drawn from various esoteric traditions, suggesting a deliberate and calculated approach to what he was doing. He wasn't just taking pictures, he was performing a kind of dark alchemy. The idea of the soul catcher myth, prevalent in some indigenous cultures where photographs were believed to steal a part of the subject's spirit, resonated deeply here. Penhaligon seemed to be actively trying to achieve this, not just accidentally. He viewed the reflection as a tangible piece of the soul, an ethereal double that could be extracted and controlled. His writings implied a belief that by capturing the reflection, he was capturing the essence, the true self, leaving only an empty shell behind. Ilara Vance's situation in this context seemed particularly tragic. She was a young woman, perhaps a bit naive, wanting a beautiful portrait. Her enthusiasm, her willingness to pose, might have made her an ideal, unsuspecting target. She likely entered the studio full of hope, unaware of the sinister intentions lurking behind the photographer's polite demeanor. Her vulnerability, her desire for a lasting image, was twisted into a means for Penhaligon to achieve his dark aims. She was not just a client, she was a subject for a chilling experiment. The reconstruction of that fateful moment, the exact instant the photograph was taken, became a chilling exercise. Imagine Ilara, seated before the ornate mirror, perhaps a little nervous, a little excited. The flash would have been bright, sudden. But what else happened in that split second? Did Penhaligon utter a specific incantation? Did he use a hidden device, a specially prepared chemical, or a focused intent to direct the mirror's conduit power? The theories suggested that at the very peak of the flash, when the image was imprinted on the plate, a spiritual transference occurred. The mirror, acting as the threshold, allowed Ilara's reflection, her very essence, to be drawn out and captured, not just by the camera, but by Penhaligon's dark will. The grim implication was clear. The missing reflection was not a malfunction, but the intended, successful result of Penhaligon's malevolent act. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had captured Ilara Vance, not just her likeness, but something far more profound and terrifying. The photograph was his trophy, proof of his dark achievement. The terrifying thought that Ilara's reflection, and perhaps her very essence, was trapped within the photograph, or the mirror itself, took hold. It wasn't just that she was gone, it was that she was imprisoned, her spiritual self held captive. The photograph became more than just an old picture. It transformed into a relic, a chilling testament to a dark ritual. It wasn't merely a historical artifact. It was a cage holding a piece of a lost soul, a silent scream frozen in time. The sepia tones, once charming, now seemed to cloak a profound and unspeakable sorrow. The image was no longer just an enigma. It was a haunting monument to a terrifying act, a window into a world where art and occultism had merged into something truly monstrous. The photograph, once a mere curiosity, now radiated an unsettling aura. This wasn't just a feeling. It was something people who had spent time with it reported, almost consistently. They talked about a strange coldness that seemed to come from the image, even on a warm day. It wasn't a physical draft, but a chill that settled deep in the bones, a coldness that spoke of something ancient and unhappy. People described whispers, faint and indistinct, that seemed to emanate from the frame when the room was quiet. They would turn their heads sharply, convinced someone had spoken their name, only to find themselves alone with the silent, sepia-toned image. Fleeting shadows, quick as a blink, were also a common report, a movement in peripheral vision, a dark shape that darted past, only to vanish when directly observed. It was enough to make anyone question their eyesight or their sanity. These weren't just isolated incidents. Multiple individuals, completely unrelated and unaware of each other's experiences, described similar phenomena after prolonged exposure to the photograph. It was as if Ilara Vance's lingering presence, or some fragmented piece of her consciousness, was tethered to the photograph itself, a ghostly echo demanding attention. The theory was that the ritual had not completely consumed her, but rather bound her in some way, leaving a part of her essence trapped within the very medium that had stolen her reflection. This led to speculation about the original mirror. If it still existed, what kind of residual energy might it possess? Could it still be a conduit, a doorway, connected to Ilara's plight? The thought was disturbing. If the mirror was indeed a powerful tool in the photographer's dark craft, it might still carry that dark energy, a silent testament to the ritual performed before it. Its very existence, if located, could be a dangerous thing. Beyond the physical sensations, individuals who delved deeply into the photograph's mystery often experienced vivid dreams and unsettling nightmares. These weren't just bad dreams. They were exceptionally real, filled with images of a young woman crying out in silent agony, or the distorted face of a man with cold, calculating eyes. Some even described waking up with a profound sense of sorrow, a feeling that wasn't their own but seemed to have seeped into their very being from the photograph. One researcher reported seeing Ilara's face in reflective surfaces around their home, a fleeting, sorrowful image that would disappear the moment they focused on it. It was as if the photograph, or what it contained, was actively reaching out, trying to communicate its pain. The undeniable chill wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A pervasive feeling of dread and sorrow hung around the image, affecting even the most hardened skeptics. People who initially dismissed the stories as folklore found themselves staring at the photograph, a knot of unease tightening in their stomachs. It was beyond doubt that something profoundly sad and wrong had happened, and the photograph was a constant, silent reminder. There was an eerie sense that the photograph itself was calling out, attempting to communicate or reveal more of its secrets. Not through words, but through the cumulative effect of these strange occurrences, the unsettling atmosphere it created, and the way it seemed to draw people in, compelling them to look closer, to understand. It was a silent plea, a trapped soul's desperate attempt to be heard, to be seen, even if only through the absence of her reflection. The psychological toll on those who dared to delve too deeply into the photograph's mystery was significant. The constant exposure to the unexplained, the chilling implications of the ritual, and the pervasive sense of dread weighed heavily. Sleep became difficult, concentration wavered, and a subtle paranoia began to creep in. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred, and the investigators found themselves questioning their own perceptions. It was a dangerous journey into the unknown, and the photograph seemed to claim a piece of everyone who engaged with it. Perhaps the most terrifying thought was the growing certainty that something unseen was observing the investigation, connected to the photograph. It was a feeling of being watched, not by human eyes, but by something else, something that lingered just beyond the veil of perception. Was it Ilara's spirit, trapped and observing? Or was it something far more sinister, the lingering influence of the photographer, still somehow connected to his dark work? The air around the photograph often felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a silent audience to the unfolding mystery. The haunting truth was becoming clearer with every strange occurrence. Ilara Vance was not merely gone. She was tragically, terrifyingly present in a way no one could fully comprehend. Her essence, her reflection, her very being was intertwined with this old photograph, a silent prisoner in a sepia world. The image was no longer just a picture. It was a living testament to a profound injustice, a dark magic, and a soul forever bound to an impossible absence. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on everyone involved, transforming a historical curiosity into a deeply personal and terrifying encounter with the supernatural. It was a truth that demanded action, a desperate search for answers, and hopefully a way to bring peace to a tormented spirit. The photograph was a portal not just to the past, but to a chilling reality where the boundaries of life and death, presence and absence, blurred into a single haunting image. The overwhelming desire to understand and, if possible, bring some measure of peace to Ilara Vance's tormented spirit began to consume the investigators. The strange occurrences, the unsettling atmosphere, the undeniable presence of something beyond understanding, it all coalesced into a desperate need for resolution. This wasn't just an academic pursuit anymore, it was a moral imperative. They felt a profound responsibility to Ilara, a woman whose image had inadvertently drawn them into her century-old tragedy. The photograph had become more than an object of study. It was a silent plea for help, and they were the only ones who seemed to hear it. Their first crucial step was an intense investigation into the fate of the original studio mirror. If the theories about it being a conduit or a trap were true, then the mirror itself held a key, perhaps the key to Ilara's predicament. They scoured old property records, auction house manifests, and even local antique dealer networks, This was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but the conviction that the mirror was central to the mystery drove them forward. They interviewed descendants of the photographer, searched through dusty archives and followed every faint lead, hoping to uncover what became of that specific fateful mirror. Was it still intact? Was it still trapping reflections? Or had its dark power been neutralized? The questions gnawed at them, fueling their relentless search. Recognizing the limits of conventional investigation, they began reaching out to those who dealt with the unconventional. They consulted paranormal investigators, individuals who specialized in documenting and understanding unexplained phenomena. They spoke with historians of the occult, hoping to find parallels in ancient texts or forgotten lore that might shed light on the photographer's dark craft. They even cautiously approached spiritualists, individuals who claimed to communicate with the deceased, hoping for some direct insight from Ilara herself. These were avenues they would have dismissed outright before encountering the photograph, but the undeniable reality of Ilara's trapped presence had shattered their skepticism. With guidance from these experts, they explored various methods of trying to connect with Ilara Vance's spirit. These weren't theatrical seances, but careful, measured attempts to create an environment conducive to communication. They tried EVP recordings, setting up sensitive audio equipment near the photograph, hoping to capture some whisper from the other side. They experimented with scrying, using other reflective surfaces, though carefully avoiding anything that resembled the original mirror's presumed function. The goal was not to provoke, but to listen, to understand, to offer a chance for Ilara to make her torment known. However, a chilling awareness accompanied these attempts. The inherent dangers of interfering with something so deeply rooted in dark magic or spiritual imprisonment. The paranormal investigators cautioned them against direct confrontation, warning that such an entity, if it was indeed the photographer's lingering influence, could be malevolent. The occult historians spoke of curses and retribution for disturbing ancient rituals. There was a very real possibility that their attempts to help Ilara could inadvertently unleash something far worse, something that had been contained, however tragically, for over a century. The thought of opening a doorway to unknown horrors weighed heavily on their minds. This fear was compounded by the possibility of unforeseen consequences. What if releasing Ilara's reflection simply transferred her torment elsewhere? What if the photographer's ritual was a complex trap designed to ensnare anyone who tried to dismantle it? The line between helping and harming became increasingly blurred. Each step they took was a calculated risk, a gamble with forces they barely understood. They meticulously documented every experiment, every strange occurrence, hoping to identify patterns and avoid making irreversible mistakes. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for Ilara, but for themselves, and potentially for anyone else who might become entangled. Driven by a desperate hope, they began an intensive search for a counter-ritual, a way to reverse the photographer's dark work. They delved into ancient texts on sympathetic magic, spiritual purification rites, and even historical accounts of exorcism, though they were careful to avoid anything that seemed purely theatrical or religious in nature. They sought out any forgotten practices that might neutralize the specific type of spiritual imprisonment they believed Ilara was suffering. This was a painstaking process, sifting through centuries of beliefs and superstitions, looking for a kernel of truth that might offer a path to freedom. Throughout this entire process, there was a palpable sense that the photograph itself was actively resisting their attempts to unravel its secrets or release its captive. Objects would inexplicably fall when they were discussing a particular theory. Electronic equipment would malfunction without explanation when pointed at the image. The air around the photograph would grow noticeably colder, heavier, almost as if it were pushing back against their inquiries. It felt like a living entity, guarding its dark secret, unwilling to relinquish its hold on Ilara. This constant resistance only reinforced their belief in the photograph's malevolent power. The growing sense of urgency became almost unbearable. The strange phenomena seemed to intensify, Ilara's subtle presence becoming more pronounced, more distressed. It felt as though time was running out, or that Ilara's torment was intensifying with each passing day. They felt her silent cries, her longing for release, and it fueled their relentless efforts. They worked tirelessly, often sacrificing sleep and personal well-being, driven by the profound empathy they felt for the trapped woman. The personal sacrifice involved in this investigation was immense. The investigators risked not only their physical safety but their mental and emotional well-being. The constant exposure to the supernatural, the lingering dread, the fear of unseen entities began to take its toll. Their relationships suffered, their professional lives became secondary, and their own sanity was often questioned by outsiders. Yet they pressed on, bound by an unspoken promise to Ilara Vance, determined to find a way to break the cruel bonds that held her reflection captive in that haunting sepia image. They knew they were deeply entangled, risking everything. But the thought of abandoning Alara to her eternal torment was simply unthinkable. The crucial breakthrough came not from a dusty archive or an ancient text, but from an almost overlooked detail within the photographer's personal effects, discovered by a distant descendant who had no idea of its significance until contacted by the investigators. Tucked inside a false bottom of an old wooden trunk, along with some dried flowers and a lock of hair, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled not with detailed accounts of his daily life, but with cryptic symbols, alchemical diagrams, and obsessive musings about light, reflection, and the capture of essence. It was here, amidst his disturbing theories, that they found the key. The photographer, a man named Arthur Finch, believed that a reflection was not merely an optical phenomenon, but a separate, ethereal entity, a spiritual twin tethered to the physical body. He theorized that by creating the perfect conditions, a specific alignment of mirrors, a unique chemical developer, and a subject in a heightened emotional state, he could sever this ethereal twin from its host, trapping it within the photographic plate. He called it immortalization through severance. The motive, chillingly, was a twisted form of legacy. Finch believed that by collecting these severed reflections, he could amass a form of spiritual power, extending his own life force and artistic impact far beyond his physical years. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a revolutionary artist, preserving the true essence of his subjects in a way no painting or sculpture ever could. Alara Vance, with her striking beauty and perhaps a melancholic air that Finch perceived as a heightened emotional state, had simply been the perfect candidate for his most ambitious experiment. He wasn't trying to steal her soul, but to capture her reflection, believing it was the purest form of her being. The journal detailed the final, horrifying understanding of what became of Alara's missing reflection. It wasn't consumed or destroyed, it was eternally bound to that specific photographic plate. Finch had perfected a process where the reflection, once separated, would imprint itself not onto the mirror's surface, but directly onto the silver halide crystals of the film. The mirror in the photograph was merely the instrument, the threshold through which the severance occurred. Once the image was developed, Alara's reflection, her ethereal twin, was locked within the sepia tones, a silent prisoner. The physical mirror itself, they learned, had been sold off with other studio properties after Finch's death, its dark purpose unknown to its subsequent owners. It likely continued its mundane existence as a decorative item, its true legacy a chilling secret. The photograph, therefore, remained a potent, unsettling artifact. It was not just a picture, but a cage. Its enduring power lay in this tragic truth. It held not just an image, but a fragmented essence, a silent scream frozen in time. The question of whether any true closure was achieved for Alara Vance's spirit remained agonizingly unanswered. The investigators had tried everything they could think of: rituals of release, attempts at spiritual communication, even physically destroying copies of the photograph. But the original, the one containing her imprisoned reflection, seemed impervious. It was a dark, self-contained universe, holding its captive fast. They could feel her presence, a faint echo of sorrow, but they could not set her free. The photograph served as a chilling cautionary tale, a stark warning about the dangers of vanity, the obsession with leaving a mark, and the terrifying consequences of tampering with the unseen forces that govern existence. Finch's twisted artistry had not granted him immortality, but it had created an eternal prison for another. The investigation left a profound and lasting impact on those who dared to uncover the truth. They were forever changed, burdened by the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary. The world no longer seemed as simple, as predictable. Every reflection, every photograph, held a new, unsettling potential. They carried with them the heavy weight of Alara's silent suffering, a constant reminder of the thin veil between reality and something far more sinister. And so, the shadow remained. It clung to the photograph, to the memory of Alara Vance, and to the minds of those who had peered into its depths. The lingering sense of unease never truly left them. They understood now that some mysteries were indeed better left undisturbed, for the truth, when it finally revealed itself, could be far more terrifying than any speculation. The final gaze upon the sepia image was always one of profound sadness and a quiet horror. It was a silent testament to a life tragically altered, a reflection stolen, and an eternal question echoing from the past. What truly lies beyond the visible world, and what happens when a human hand reaches out to grasp it? The photograph offered no answers, only a chilling, enduring silence.